Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. My name is Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and this week we are diving into our brand new mini course on Shakespeare's history, and it is all about Shakespeare and mythological creatures. This week we're taking a look at Did Shakespeare know about centaurs? Middle Ages beastiaries became popular books, and it was just massive collections of illustrated animals. They collected diagrams and explanations of the animals around the world, and each animal was connected to a meaning or a moral lesson. This stemmed from the idea that all of creation was the word of God, and every living thing had a special meaning assigned to it. There were more than a few flaws to this approach. Firstly, because their naturalism was a little faulty, but secondly, because there was no requirement that you put any distinction between real animals and fake animals. So all of the actual living creatures that were around the world, many of them which would have been exotic to people in England, like lions and tigers and elephants and things they'd never seen natively in England before, were all mixed in with mythological creatures like centaurs and phoenixes and dragons and animals of great lore. And it was all in there together, and they were all equally ranked. And so you ended up with this giant book of animals and this vague understanding, and historians are divided actually in their opinion on exactly to what degree people like William Shakespeare would have thought the mythological creatures were real. There probably were some people who felt the dragons and the centaurs were every bit as realistic in existence as the elephant and the tiger. William Shakespeare mentions centaurs, most notably in his play The Tempest, with his character of Caliban, who is himself centaur. But Shakespeare references centaurs, Sagittarius, and half-human, half-animal creatures in more than just The Tempest. These animals show up either directly or indirectly in Shakespeare's King Lear, Comedy of Errors, Midsummer Night's Dream, Troilus and Cressida, and even Othello. Natural history of 16th and 17th century England is a mixed bag of accurate science, and some legends and mythology got crammed into the conversation there, all mixed in together. As an example of what they were dealing with and the mix between the real and the mythological for William Shakespeare is the pelican. The pelican was believed at that time to tear open its breast to give birth to its young, and so it was giving life through the shedding of its blood. As such, many medieval beastiaries would say that the pelican was a living representation of Jesus Christ, who, according to the Christian beliefs, shed his blood to save sinners and give them new life, or the new birth. The Bible calls it being born again. And so the pelican, through their naturalistic understanding of what the pelican did, which, by the way, the pelican does not give birth that way, but according to what they understood about the pelican, they assigned a moral attribute to that animal, which then writers and artists would go on to use when they would paint paintings or write plays like William Shakespeare did. So when you want to understand the different characters like a centaur that William Shakespeare is using on stage, you kind of have to understand what were the moral associations with animals like this. And it turns out the centaur was a symbol of hypocrisy. The earliest known bestiary came from the 2nd century, and it was a Greek book called Physiologus. It was a compilation of writings from people like Aristotle and Herodotus, Solinus, and other naturalists who had written their own books about animals, and this book kind of put all of those beliefs together. Following Physiologus, there was Saint Isidore of Seville and Saint Ambrose, who added a religious message to these animals, including passages from the Bible and the Septuagint. There was also the Queen Mary Psalter and the Isabella Psalter. And as you might expect from a psalter, many of those beasts are tied to the psalm that the animal was illustrating. Interesting fact, Leonardo da Vinci even wrote his own bestiary. Bestiaries were organized in different ways based upon the text. They could be organized by animal groups, like the ones that lived on land versus the one that lived in the ocean, or they could have been put together in alphabetical order. But they had no distinction between existing animals and imaginary animals, and that meant that dragons, unicorns, the basilisk, griffin, and caladrius were common, sitting right next to things like bears and boars and deers and lions and elephants that people had actually seen with their own eyes. When it came to the centaur was a very dangerous animal. He was known to be violent, and particularly the centaur was sexually violent. He was known to prey on women and was known for rape. In Shakespeare's The Tempest, Caliban was the son of the witch Sycorax. He was a half human, half monster, and after his island becomes occupied by Prospero and Miranda, Caliban is captured and made to be a slave. While he's referred to as not quite human, not quite animal, he is the only human inhabitant of the island that is not otherwise, quote, not honored with a human shape. That's Act 1, Scene 2 of The Tempest. Depending on how the play gets performed, sometimes Caliban is shown as a wild man. Other people depict him as a deformed man, a beast, or some kind of mix between fish and man, like a merman, a dwarf, or there's even been sometimes he's portrayed as a tortoise. I've read scholarly works that suggest Caliban was intended to represent the Native Americans because exploration to what would become the United States was happening around the time that this was written. The Tempest was first performed at court in 1611, I believe I'm saying that right, and Jamestown was founded in 1607. So they were going to the New World, and Indians, Native Americans, were often captured there, forced into servitude, and even brought back to England and placed on display as a kind of festive event for Native Londoners. There's records of Native Americans being put on display as like, come see an Indian for 25 cents kind of thing in London. So there are some critical accounts of the Tempest that suggest Caliban was intended to be a metaphor for this kind of exploration and colonialism on England's part. Where did Shakespeare learn about these centaurs, and how did he know what attributes his audience would expect to see from this kind of creature? Was he challenging their expectations and giving Caliban some traits they might not have expected? All of these are great questions, and I've narrowed down what I think are 5 good places to learn more about what could have influenced Shakespeare in his writing of the Centaur in the form of Caliban, as well as some of the references we find in the other plays I mentioned. The first one is the history of animals and naturalism and the understanding of the world through the beastiaries that we've already mentioned. The world was largely a religious place for William Shakespeare. There was an infusion between religion and the natural world that doesn't exist today in the same way. It was pervasive. You didn't necessarily choose to be a religious person. You were born and you were following this. It was a type of governmental rule at that time. So it all went together in people's understanding of things. Second place that Shakespeare could have learned about centaurs would be from Ovid. Ovid is a well-established source for William Shakespeare for many of his plays, and it only makes sense to think Shakespeare would have turned to Ovid in this case as well. In Ovid, the centaur was prone to violence and rape. At the feast of Hippodamia, Ovid writes that one centaur tried to violate the bride, and the feast ends in this nasty battle, and Shakespeare references that feast of Hippodamia in 2 of his plays, both A Midsummer Night's Dream and Titus Andronicus. The third place Shakespeare might have been influenced by centaurs is astrology. Centaurs belong primarily to Greek mythology, and they combine a savage and untamed animal nature with the wisdom of the human culture. The wisest, and in some texts, the oldest of the centaurs was Chiron. He was tamer than the other centaurs, and he was educated by the gods. And so he was more compassionate. He didn't want to hold on to all of his knowledge for himself. And so he tutored all the great heroes of Greece, including Achilles, Jason, and Hercules. The sad part about Chiron's story is that he was poisoned by an arrow. Hercules actually poisoned Chiron. Now, centaurs are immortal, and so his agony was unbearable. He was hit by a poison dart, but he couldn't die. And so Chiron shed his immortality and gave it to Prometheus so that he could die and no longer be poisoned. Well, Zeus decided to immortalize Chiron through an image in the night sky in memory of this noble teacher. And today, Chiron's constellation in the sky is known as Sagittarius. Medieval images of Sagittarius generally fall into 3 categories. You have centaurs, satyrs, and humans, and all of these are holding longbows, and a couple of them have crossbows. In Othello, Othello's house is known as the Sagittary, which, considering all of the implications of Othello being accused of sexual misconduct, it's interesting that Shakespeare would have called his home the Sagittary. The fourth place that Shakespeare might have drawn from in order to portray the centaur, or certainly I think something he would have had to consider, was actually from England's history. King Stephen of England used the centaur as his heraldic symbol. One account says that, quote, the city of Blois, capital of Blaisois, a county of France, used the ensign of a Sagittary as an emblem of hunting, much practiced in that wood country, watered by the great river Loire. Stephen adopted the banner of the Sagittary in the Civil War, which he carried on in England against the rights of the Empress Matilda. His residence being in London, her partisans gave to Stephen the name of the Sagittary of London Park. With Shakespeare's focus on English history, these sources could have definitely influenced his knowledge and use of centaurs, as well as some of his stories. But unpacking the history of King Stephen of England is for another episode. Last place that I think William Shakespeare could have been influenced in terms of his understanding of centaurs is through Renaissance painting. There are two that I want to show you today. Gian Jacopo Caraglio, he painted Hercules killing the centaur Nicias between 1500 and 1570. This would be the same Nessus from the story of the Feast of Hippodamia, which was mentioned in A Midsummer and Titus Andronicus. The second painting is from 1550. This is by Pierre d'Escalier. He was originally a cartographer that made multiple maps in the 16th century, and he painted this massive map for King Henry II, and it was designed to be laid out on a table with like an established north, and they called it like, this is up. So the south was actually up and the north was down. But across the map, he has all kinds of monsters and animals and beasts and like mixes of people who look like animals or act like animals. And he apparently based these drawings on the account of Marco Polo, who claimed that people lived in darkness half the year and apparently lived like beasts all of the year. There's a picture of a dog-headed man known as Cyanocephalus. D'Escalier included the term homme monstreux, meaning monstrous men. Scary beasts living in far-off places seemed logical, and to the medieval Europeans, north was often the direction of the devil. While these paintings don't necessarily show that Shakespeare was influenced by Renaissance paintings, although you can make that argument, I'm pointing it out to say that Shakespeare was living in a time when these animals were part of the popular culture and massive consciousness of the people of England. So it makes sense that when he was presenting a form of entertainment, the same stories that influenced the contemporary plays and artwork around Shakespeare were also influencing Shakespeare himself. So he was obviously keeping his finger on the pulse of the artistic culture and using that knowledge in his works. Whew. So this week's episode, I hope, has convinced you that this topic is a massive, massive topic. If you want to look into the connection between astrology, mythology, centaurs, and Shakespeare, you could spend a lifetime studying this. Many scholarly academics do. If you're just interested in having fun and looking into this further and seeing some great paintings and pictures of centaurs from the 12th through 16th century, I encourage you to check out the show notes for today's episode. I'm going to include all of the massive amount of history I used to put together today's episode, as well as some links to recommended resources and places you can learn more and explore this further, all in the show notes. You can find that at cassidycash.com/centaurs. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Girl. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next week. And don't forget that this is part 1 of an entire history course that will be going into the membership area. So if you like learning about history like this, you want to go further, you want to be able to talk with me about it, you'd like to be able to download all the guides and ebooks that go along with things like this, consider becoming a member. Not only are you supporting the work we do here and allowing us to bring more history to you each week, but you get behind the scenes access to things that are only available in the members area. And when you sign up, I will also send you a beautiful piece of Shakespeare swag to welcome you to the group. Find out more about that at cassidycash.com/member, and I will see you guys next Saturday. Bye-bye.